classroom where I go in every Friday and I see a few kids and do play therapy for 45-minute sessions, doing cognitive behavioral therapy, role play, and other things to help them heal from the trauma past that they have been exposed to.
Awesome. Reverend Terry Williams, let me allow you to reintroduce yourself and why this particular topic.
Good morning. Good morning. As Kingsley always says, I have to claim ownership to the Department of Corrections. I was formerly a parole manager overseeing the Bridgeport Parole and Community Service, as well as New Haven and Waterbury. Since retired from there, currently working at the workplace as the vice president of the reentry programs, working with individuals still, reintegrating them back into their communities, offering them employment opportunities, training, career development, and just servicing the needs of the individuals who are returning citizens. This is near and dear to me, working with the Department of Corrections, because many of the individuals who are returning from incarceration have and still are experiencing trauma in their lives. Some have never dealt with it. Some have never overcome some of the traumas that they have been affected by. So this is near and dear. As our brother Muhammad said, we don't want to continue to use the word trauma because it re-victimizes the individuals.
Want to chime in, Brother Shafiq?
Yeah, I like what both of them are saying. The concept of trauma is really, it's just taken into a whole different place, right? So it's like we have trauma in urban America, and then that normally denotes African American, Hispanic, Latino, and then there's like this other type of trauma. There's also trauma like in law enforcement, for instance, right? And then there's trauma in emergency rooms. And so I like what both of y'all are saying around the trauma bonding, because a lot of times we find ourselves in those situations. We're just together, it's a day off, we're supposed to be doing something, and we're talking about either our tragedy, somebody else's tragedy, and then what turns into the struggle story, right? I got a struggle story. Brother Muhammad wants to relate to me, so he tells me his struggle story. Then the Rev tells me her struggle. Then, like you said, we're just all trauma bonded, right? And we leave feeling a little bit better. I call it like the garbage bag, because we took some stuff out of our garbage bag, so it feels lighter. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we've made ourselves stronger for the next event. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
So this is why training is necessary for a clinician in trauma, because when somebody is traumatized, there are three choices. Either they fight, they take flight, or they freeze. And so what you see with acting out in our community, especially violence among young brothers, you'll see that most of that trauma has been inherited generationally. And what I mean by that is they've done studies where they found that, like, take for instance, the World Trade Center, the women that were pregnant that were in that tragedy, their children had higher stress hormones or cortisol and had a harder time dealing with situations where a lot of times normally we'll be able to deal with hardships. So what that showed is that trauma can be passed down genetically. They're also doing studies on epigenetics, like saying whether it was the Jews in the Holocaust, the Japanese internment camps, that when the adults were traumatized, they pass on trauma through the DNA. Now, it doesn't destroy the DNA, but it changes the way DNA is actually carried out, or what it produces. So you can actually have poor health, susceptibility towards drugs, drug use, propensity towards violence, the inability to regulate your emotions passed down from your ancestors who were traumatized. Now, who was more traumatized than those of us who were brought from Africa, 9,000 miles into America, and didn't just have slavery, but slavery, Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and also urban violence up to this moment. So we've never truly healed. Now, to address what Shafiq was saying, yeah, when the groups just talk, that's a support group. But in a clinical setting, the first step to helping somebody with trauma is to make them feel emotionally and physically safe. We don't heal unless we feel safe. The question is, how many of us in our community feel emotionally safe, physically safe? Or are we being re-traumatized to where we never get to a place of safety? So in a clinical trauma group or a session, it is to help the person to feel safe and to give them safe space, safe place, so that they can actually move in the right direction towards healing. And that means having a safe person that they can talk about their trauma to. The trauma might be anything from growing up and you were traumatized as a child in your religious setting and you've never dealt with it, but you've never had anybody safe to speak to it, but it causes hypervigilance, anxiety, lack of digestion, lack of sleep, and also some physiological things like headaches and other things, and ultimately may cause a breakdown. Now, how do you deal with that? You have to have first a safe space and a safe place. And then clinically, once you know what the problem is, then you can diagnose it and then move towards healing through different methods and coping skills and strategies. So what we do as clinicians is a little different than people just getting together. It takes skill. It's almost like an education where, yeah, anybody can teach a lesson, but do they have the ability to take a child that doesn't know and skillfully move them through assessments that they could actually score well and move on to the next grade? So what I do and what many do, what Terry may do, is more than just sitting together and talking. It is using clinical skills to actually heal people from trauma.
Kingsley on
mute.
Mm-hmm.
Terry, I was asking you to chime in.
To piggyback off of Brother Muhammad, we also have to address the fact that many of our brothers and sisters were taught not to seek counseling. And so therefore they live with this trauma for many, many years and generations to generations. And breaking that cycle is crucial, because the only way that we are going to grow as a community and heal as a community is each one has to, seek within themselves and find out what they are dealing with and, seek professional help. A lot of times we, and the forefathers and mothers, they sought religion. And religion was the safe haven. The churches were the safe haven. The churches were the leaders in the community. They led a lot of the rallies, the marches. Those leaders were strong leaders in the churches. And so people felt safe when they went to churches. And again, through the years, people haven't been safe in churches, with the bombings, with the shootings, and things like that. So we have to make sure that we are putting people in the right place to receive the help that they need to overcome the trauma that, we have dealt with. And I always say that an urban community, we have been victimized in so many ways. Right out the gate. Many students are walking to school and they walk across the police tapes when you have a murder or a shooting, and they see those things where others, students may not see that. So they're faced with it, even if they are not a part of it. but it's because of their community. They are, traumatized by a lot of things that are happening.
So you
The-
basically nailed it. It goes right along with our intro to the show,
Kingsley.
which was cut short because normally have to go less than a minute, so Facebook does not shut us down.
So
That
Kingsley,
intro was self-destruction.
yeah.
Like KRS
Yeah,
One and
Kevin has a comment, man. Kevin has
Yeah,
something to
I
say.
just have just
Go ahead,
one sec.
Kevin.
Based on what Terry said, now there's another reason. I have to give the some of us, rightfully so, didn't trust going to therapy for historical reason. In the South, after Reconstruction and when there was the Great Migration from the South, a lot of us who were are from Chicago and even New Haven and other places have family from Mississippi, North Carolina, and other places. When there was a movement that when we came from the South, we came to the projects in St. Louis and Chicago, and there was government funds, what we call either Section 8 today and anything, for people to move. And what happened was there had to be a social worker. This is why I really became a Black social worker. I still hold my credentials in education, but the reason why I really wanted to be a Black social worker, in GBAP, I'm the only Black male clinician, and CRJ, which is Community Resources for Justice, which I'm doing work for in New Haven, I'm the only man in the whole organization that's a clinician or a therapist in the whole organization. And the reason why I became a social worker, because social workers are the ones that scared Black people. Let's be honest. There is a trauma. They used to come. And in order for the woman to get an apartment with her children and funds, they wanted to make sure there were no Black males in the house, no father, nobody there. So the social worker would come in and look for shoes. They would look for ties. They would look for any Black male clothing. They wanted no sign that there were any Black men in that house taking care of their children or being husbands. The other thing was they knew that the brothers would come at night to be with their families at a time when they didn't think social workers would come. Social workers broke locks, violated people's property to make sure that there were no men in that home. Now, this is documented. And so there were children, when they went to school, their mother would tell them, don't you talk to the social worker and tell them anything about our family business. So there's this relationship based on, if I say something to someone, I'm not safe, and they're going to come and break up my family. And so some of us today have grandparents that witnessed that, and they have passed on the fact that the pastor may be safe, the imam may be safe, but don't you go talking to that therapist because, in the words of Kanye recently, it was Bipolar 1, says, he said that he stopped going to therapy because his therapist is working with the feds.
No doctor. Nope.
Which I wanted to tell him, brother, find you a therapist that you can trust because you need it.
No
So,
Kanye. No Kanye.
So with that, there's a historical, and that's what we refer to as historical and generational trauma that manifests in the mistrust, which a lot of Black people have mistrust for the system, whether it's COVID shots or whether it is going to get therapy. And that is part of our trauma. It manifests in mistrust for the system.
Well said. Well said. I love my brother.
Go ahead. You do it, and then I'm going. I got a fireball. Go.
This is the Urban Talk. This is the Urban Talk Radio 103.5 FM WNHHLP. I am your host, Kingsley Ossei, and my co-host Shafiq. And if you are just joining us today on the Urban Talk Radio, you can join the conversation on Facebook at Bull Mice and Twitter at Bull Mice. Also on my Facebook page, Kingsley Ossei. You can also stream this show on your smartphone or computer by logging on to newhavenindependent.org and all platforms. In the studio today, we have our very special guest, Brother Kevin Muhammad, who's the lead clinician at GBAP Inc., the home of Executive Director Reverend Nancy Kingwood. I like Nancy a lot. I mean, that's why I keep mentioning her name. Also, we also have Reverend Terry Williams. She's adult parole manager. Was it parole or probation manager? I never get it right.
Parole manager.
Yeah,
Working the workplace right now.
Go to jail. That's parole, like go to jail.
I've never committed crime in my life, so I'm never right. Black man that never committed a crime in his life.
5.
All right. So today's topic is the effects of urban and generational trauma. Now, Shafiq, you wanted to
yeah. So 2 things. So one I want to throw out is when I mentioned the part about trauma bonding. I'm referring to trauma bonding in the natural setting it happens because, unfortunately, the vast majority of our community is not in therapy. They're in the barbershop. I'm talking about when we're at the cookouts. I'm talking about at the nightclubs. I'm talking about in the bus stop. That people are trauma bonding all over the city, everywhere but therapy. Because what you said, doctor, therapy is not even something that is defined as being normal. Even outside of African American communities, it's still considered a taboo. And I know certainly when I was in law enforcement, don't you dare mention as a cop that you're going to therapy because it marginalized you and made you appear to be weaker than the others in the culture, right? When in fact, my theory has always been it is actually your therapy that you get. If you're getting therapy, it actually helps you navigate your way through the culture without getting caught up in the BS, right? But it hasn't changed. So here's what I just want to add to that. You mentioned about the social workers. But we all agree that those social workers did not do that on their own volition. That was policy. And that same policy continues till today.
Absolutely.
So I dropped this nugget. When I was in law enforcement, we were trained to partner with DCF. And part of the DCF partnership was DCF, the police, and in juvenile probation, they would have a FWISN, family with service needs. In order to get a child and family with service needs, they needed to be arrested. Once they get arrested, then you automatically report the parent to DCF. That forces DCF to trigger a mandate where they gotta come to the house. We were trained, and there's probably still trained till this today, when you're an officer and you go to a house for something around dealing with a child or even domestic violence or whatever, open the refrigerator. They said, open the refrigerator and look. And if you didn't see no food, that's a sign of neglect. Trigger a DCF report. So there's so that whole concept of mandated reporter, it actually now doesn't even make the imam or the reverend or anybody safe. Because the child care worker, the after school worker, the counselor, the coach, your volunteer person, depending on what they're volunteering for and what kind of grants they might be getting through a nonprofit, everybody's a mandated reporter. And that mandated reporter triggers social workers or some type of policy generated come in and separate. So how do we address, so the question is I have is, how do we address that policy? How do we start working on that policy change?
So here's what I think we need to do, right? I actually think that therapy should be a part of the job of being a police officer because they're experienced sometimes the most terrible situations on a daily basis. Now, remember at the beginning, I talked about the unconscious, which I also want to talk about the subconscious. Media, press, imagery pays a lot of into what we do daily. So you figure when you go to court, go to any court in New Haven, who do you see in front of the judge most of the time? Black people. So you're a police officer, you're even a principal of a school, you're whatever you do. So something tells you somehow, unconsciously or subconsciously, if these people are going to jail at this high rate of portion, they have to be arrested first. In order for them to be arrested first, they have to be either profiled or they have to be gone after. So if these people go to jail and they're doing time, a lot of us unconscious. Now, this is not something we do consciously. There must be something bad about these people. And it seems like the people from Dixwell Avenue, Stratford Avenue, or the Ville, the Trey, or whatever, seem to be going a lot more than other people. So maybe it's their communities that are bad they're coming from. And this saturates our unconscious. It's not until we get into a therapy session by a Black clinician that's using post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is a theory, they haven't accepted it in the DSM, that started by first Naeem Akbar, but was sharpened up by Dr. Joyce DeGruy, that's saying that the lens that we use for most things is the lens that we were given in slavery and is internalized racism. The reason why DCF has collaborated, because the only reason I'm a lead clinician for the Urban Trauma Center is because DCF doesn't have enough Black clinicians that have a compassionate heart and understand what Black people are going through that can sit in front of them. We can push back. I'm a mandated reporter, but I understand Black life. So when I see something in the Black community, I can push back and say, you know what? The lens under which I'm going to report this is biased. And so it takes a certain type of revealing the unconscious and subconscious. We do it. You know, what happened with those officers in Memphis? When you look at it, yeah, one officer might have had trouble with the brother, but how many of us have this unconsciousness that no matter how hard we train, that internalized racism comes up? And because that brother looked like me, I'm gonna hit him harder, beat him harder. There's something about that rises to the occasion in the moment, no matter what our training comes. And then on the flip side, those that are white, even though they have sensitivity training and culturally responsive training and all that, genetically passed on to them through mindsets unconsciously, because we don't deal with it therapeutically constantly. When they make a decision, it's racist. So
Kingsley's fascinated. You know, Kingsley's fascinated. He's like, go Kingsley.
Nah, this is what he do. You trying to kick knowledge?
I'm watching you, Kingsley. I'm watching you. Kingsley's fascinated. He's like, all the stuff I done told him.
This is what
all
he
the stuff
does.
that I done told him.
He
don't listen to me though. He don't listen to me.
We did tens and hundreds of youth violence prevention assemblies, and Kevin Mohammed, this is what he does.
I'm trying to get Kevin on this radio show for a year. You like
wrap up so I could chime in. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you know, so what I also wanted to say about that is recently.
You didn't talk about the policy though, Kevin. I gotta.
Okay.
You know I love you, and I'm giving you out.
Trying to wrap up on that because
but we gotta make sure we're talking about the right stuff, because
right. So
I can't. Here's what I just want to say this. Why? Because there's something inherently wrong when the police are used to weaponize a policy. I must say that. There's something, so what you mentioned, like the officer having discretion. When it comes to that kind of, like the DCF thing, and like there's no discretion.
Yeah, so here's the thing,
right?
Here's the thing, Shafiq, I have a code of ethics as a social worker. And some things are legal, some things are ethical. I didn't come into this field to be not be a revolutionary. I was a revolutionary before I got here. And so ethically, me going with police is not ethical when it comes to my community, and I will push back. And my licensure says at times when I'm being challenged legally and ethically that I must do what is ethical. And so it's no coincidence that in the civil rights movement, the Black men in many of the civil rights movement that stood against justice came from a social work background. And so what I'm saying is I am not afraid to push we have a responsibility. Now, as far as me making money and have a job, I'm a multifaceted genius as far as I'm concerned. I can make money any kind of way, but I came into this field to make a difference. So if a police officer wants to go with me to a home with a child, unless my life is in serious danger, that's not something that I'm going to do. and I have the right to also make a report and give context in that report.
Right.
A lot of us, because we've been programmed, when it comes to a policy, we have a mindset. So there is policy, but there's also ethics and discretion.
How do we get, so I'm gonna just push on this again. How do we get the police out of DCF? But right now, if there's a DCF issue and they need to go get that child, the police show up, and the police are going to be like, DCF is here to take your child. And sometimes it's not the worst case scenario. Sometimes it could just be some basic stuff, right? And the DCF's got to come and take that child, and the police are there. And that's a policy thing. Am I?
It's not a policy thing.
It's a policy really, under the police department. They're following their policy
thing. It's really a locational because you're not going with the police in the suburbs,
right,
to take a child.
Definitely,
the social worker is going by themselves. I went to a training and I was just so mortified when the DCF worker stated this. If I go to a house and the house is well lit and the children are left alone home and they may not even open the door, or they talk through the door and they let them know they can't let them in because their mommy or daddy is not home, DCF is gone. But if they go to a neighborhood that is not well lit and there's people hanging outside and the little kids inside the house would say the same exact thing, they are taking those children. And so that's what, Brother Muhammad was speaking about, the implicit bias that we all have within.
And we don't hear about, so here's what I'm saying, Reverend, and here's what I'm charging. I'm charging y'all today. Ding, ding. We don't hear about that. There's no absolute conversation. It's like that conversation, like there's so much focus on the police, which there should be. You always got to keep accountability. No one's talking about the implicit bias in that.
Well, recently,
I wanted to chime in on this because you said something, please. I don't want to forget my thoughts. I jotted it down. You said therapy should be part of the job of a police officer.
Absolutely.
Perfection and qualification to be a police officer does not exist right now. Because of the shortage of educators and police officers, they are pushing them through so fast that they are coming into the field without the right qualifications to be a police officer. Now, we just went through the whole defunding the police thing, which was the wrong verbiage to use, and people didn't understand what defunding the police means. Defunding the police was basically shifting the funds to places such as these topics, and why it's so important. A police officer should not have to wear the hat of being that therapy.
Yeah. So Kingsley, when I said that, right?
If the funds understand correctly.
Yeah. There is a diagnosis called post-traumatic stress disorder. That's in the DSM. That came back because some of your toughest guys, soldiers, firemen, police officers, and because I have a men's group, right? And so it's easy for us to get tough on the outside and everything. But once we experience trauma, that can't be solved by toughness. That's only solved through vulnerability and actually what we would call getting soft, right? And so police officers experience a similar, and some of us in our community too, a similar experience that soldiers in war experience, right? It's beyond what trauma is something that is beyond the normal coping skills to deal with. They're working overtime. So there should be some amount of hours that they are required, I think, to check in for the health of the police officer. Now, when a police officer goes through this all day long, who do they go home to? Their children. So they're shifting from a traumatic situation to home, which causes issues, or they never really overcame the traumatic situation that they had before. And so they meet somebody that might be innocent, That had nothing to do with the previous situation, but they have been triggered and they're dealing with this situation without any type of coping skill or knowing any kind of awareness unconsciously. And here comes an innocent person in the community that sometimes is the recipient of police violence. So I believe teaching, where teachers are constantly in a community where the children are victims of trauma. And let me say this, trauma is something that's just not witnessed. There's three kinds of trauma: direct trauma, vicarious trauma, compassionate trauma. Your nervous system, can pick up when somebody is anxious or depressed, and it can affect you without you knowing. So if you're around other officers that are triggered, as an officer that's mentally healthy, you can be triggered and also be a victim of vicarious or compassionate trauma for your fellow officer. Somebody ought to be checking on these officers to make sure that they are mentally healthy to go out to serve and protect. It's the same thing in education. It's the same thing in any field where you're dealing with a population of people who are the recipients of either generational trauma or urban trauma. Every one of us needs to be checked on by some clinician.
I think it's traumatic enough for us to even think the 5 Black police officer can beat up a Black man to death after what our generation witnessed from Rodney King.
Mm-hmm.
And this was even worse than Rodney King. Matter of fact, big shout out to Andrea, my wife. She wrote us a curriculum for today's Agents of Change on remembering Tyree Nichols. And she also made a comparison to, he said, let's take it back. What do you know about Emmett Till? You see, this is Black History Month. She brought it to Emmett Till, and I will bet you that about 30 students of Agents of Change may not know nothing about Emmett Till. And you're talking about CRT, critical race theory. You got the governor, Governor DeSantis, trying to take away, history, Black history from being taught to our high school students. I mean, it gets political. If you watch yesterday's State of the Union, President Joe Biden went in, whether you agree or disagree. A lot of the things that we face in our community is politically motivated, whether you agree to it or not. You're talking about generational trauma, generational whatever it is that you want to talk about. He talked about police brutality, that we deserve to go home. He said he never had that conversation with his son about what it is to be pulled over, what to do when you are pulled over by the police officer. Unfortunately, we do. You see, we had a president that was actually saying this at the State of the Union. Does it mean that he does not support police officers? No, it doesn't mean that. He also said that police officers must be accountable to their actions.
So I would like to say that critical race theory, to me, calling it critical race theory and not just history, is a mental health issue. And I want to bring into 2 groups. One are the Jews that suffered under Nazi Germany. The reason why they say never forget is because they understand epigenetics. They understand what they suffered was passed on genetically to the next generation. And so there is a sensitivity to their history and understanding that even though the elders are gone, that they still have the remnants of trauma from birth that's passed on to generation. The second group is what they call the Hanoi, which are the generation from the Japanese that are the children of Japanese internment camps. They've done more research. Remember, Japanese Americans, not Japanese from Japan, were put in concentration camps in America. These are Japanese that didn't even know how to speak Japanese. Japanese that didn't even know how to speak Japanese because they were American citizens. They noticed that in schools, their behavior, they were acting out. They noticed that they had hypervigilance. They had a propensity to have heart attacks quicker than anybody. They had health consequences and situations, and they realized that the trauma they experienced at the hands of the American government didn't only directly affect the parents who suffered in America, but the Japanese children to this day. One of the ways they deal with it is historic awareness. Now, the Japanese made a mistake. The way they dealt with it was to forget about the history because it was too traumatizing. And they noticed the more they didn't talk about it, the worse they got health-wise. So when you don't talk about what happened in your history, you don't release it, you don't address it, and you keep it in, it actually causes more psychological harm and damage. A lot of our children are acting the way they act because they don't understand that they're the recipients of a history riddled with trauma. What does it do when you're aware? You can stop yourself and say, I'm acting this way because of Emmett Till. I'm acting this way because of the riots. I'm acting this way because from the years of 1960 to 1971, they took Black people. This is recent. I was born in 1972. And they conducted cancer research exposing them to high levels of radiation because the United States government wanted to know how much radiation people can take. And they didn't tell these Black people that they were exposed. And this is just in the 70s. They've also done research with Blacks that graduated from Yale University and became Yale University professors and worked high positions. And notice that the Yale graduates that were recipients of affirmative action that are now in their 60s and 70s died earlier than their white counterparts because racism is deadly. Oppression is deadly, and it has an effect even if we're educated
Talk
Black
about
folk.
it. Now you're preaching.
Now
you're preaching. You're preaching now.
We might have to bring you back again
Preaching now.
before the Black History Month is over to go in depth
Black
about
History Month.
Racism. I need Mr. Reverend Terry to chime in, and then Brother Kevin, I'll give you opportunity to go through a couple of flyers that I have here as to what you are doing at our GBAP. We got
to say, Kingwood is the flyer queen, minutes. So we got a flyer for everything at GBAP.
We got about 3-4 minutes to wrap up. So let me have Ms. Terry chime in real quick, and then Brother Kevin, you have about 2 minutes to talk about everything going on at GBAP that's coming up. Go ahead, Ms. Terry. Reverend Terry.
I just want to say when Brother Shafiq asked about, policies, I know when we were working with the youth in our program, a lot of the youth asked, where are the programs for them?
Yes.
A lot of times they were not getting the help, as you stated, unless they were part of the system, the criminal justice system. So that's one thing that we have to really and have been changing, because there are community partners that are out there that have programming for all ages in the community. And we have to do a better job at putting that information out into the community. So from all ages, there's community providers that are working with our children, not just the after school
service providers, you meant.
Yeah. So they are out there.
I have this thing right here. And topics that our students wrote themselves that they would like to tackle this year. Our Agents of Change scholars: gang violence, sexual violence, hate crimes, authoritative abuse, domestic violence, colorism, white supremacy, school shootings, parental abuse, drug abuse, trafficking, mental health, teacher shortage, lack of resources, targeting, broken families, and bullying. We have two cohorts: the violence prevention cohort and leadership through social justice cohort. Out of those two cohorts, these are topics that our scholars said they would like to tackle for this next two 10-week programs that we are running. Brother Kevin Mohammed, you have 1.5.
I want to just say that, we have to, as, Brother Muhammad was saying, our history, we have to know where we come from so that we know where we're going. And I just recently studied the social economics and injustice in the biblical realm. So we have to know that it's not just America. It stems back, rooted back to the Bible. A lot of the things that have been created. So we have to know where we are coming from so that we know where we're going. And so when we do that, you know, I love my brother because as the educator, I can sit here and listen to him for hours, the knowledge that he drops.
Yeah.
And, you know, we have to make sure that we're putting it out to the community.
Brother Kevin, you have 1 minute to just summarize.
Dr. Kevin Muhammad.
Dr. Kevin, you have.
Get it right.
You have 1 minute.
For that.
You have 1 minute to
So-
summarize everything coming up, and then we will be glad to bring you back again. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
so we're starting an urban trauma center at GBAP 25 Ford Place. I'm the lead clinician. So we're asking everyone to contact me at kmuhammad@gbap.org. I can send you a referral form. I have to admit it's growing. I'm getting referrals every day. It looks like we may have to hire more people because there's only one of me. But we're asking, it's for children 4 through 18 who are BIPOC. That means that they're Black, Indigenous, people of color. And we're trying to address trauma in our community and our families. And so we're asking them to sign up and to get the help that they need.
All right.
Send me the information.
This is the Urban Talk
DJ
Radio
mode
103.5 FM WNHH.
mode.
I am your host, Kingsley, Ossei, and your co-host. And if you are just joining us today on Urban Talk Radio, you can join the conversation on Facebook at Bold Minds and Twitter at Bold Minds.
Thank you, Reverend Kev. Dr. Kev.
Thank you, Mayor.
Awesome. Awesome. Gotta come back, man. Dropped a lot tonight.